Hello, good morning, or whenever you're watching this. So, this lecture is going to be going over reasoning and argumentation, and this is the next step with persuasive speaking. So, we've already talked about the different types of persuasive speeches, questions of fact, value, and policy, as well as all of the different organizational patterns. So what we're going to be talking about in this lecture today is a bit more of the detailed view of creating an argument, of using reasoning, of supporting your claim. So this is information that we would be including in our main points in order to create a persuasive speech. And so before we really get into that, I do want to make sure that everyone knows what I'm talking about and understands the words that I'm using and how I'm using them. So these four words are going to be really important and we're going to return to time and time again in this lecture. So the first word is argument, and that is the stated position that includes your evidence and your reasoning. And with that, we also need to know claim. So claim is your proposition. It's the conclusion you're trying to prove. For almost all of us, this is going to be our topic and position. So what is your topic, and are you for it or are you against it? Next is evidence, and that is supporting materials that supports your claim or provides grounds for belief. And lastly, we have warrant. And the warrant are the reasons or justifications for why the evidence supports the claim. So the warrant is the connecting factor between your piece of evidence and your claim. So with that in mind, let's go into the different patterns of reasoning. Now there are a lot of patterns of reasoning. We're only going to talk about 5 of the most common ones here. And this usually refers to what is the relationship between the evidence and the claim. So the 5 patterns of reasoning that we're going to be covering is induction, deduction, causal, analogical, and reasoning by sign. So let's begin with inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning uses specific instances to support a broader claim. So here what we're doing is we're going from the specific to the general. So for all of these different types of reasoning, I'll explain them, provide a definition, and then I will give an example of that reasoning in action. So we're going from specific pieces of evidence to support a general, a broader, a larger claim. So for this example, we're using multiple specific instances, multiple specific cases to prove a larger conclusion. So specific case number 1. In St. Lucia, fair trade growers receive almost double their old rate for their produce. Specific case number 2. Fair trade produce growers in Chile saw a similar rise. Specific case number 3. In Kenya, fair trade growers make a third more than other growers. So here is our conclusion. By purchasing goods from a fair trade produce, you can help ensure that they are being justly compensated. So we have 3 specific smaller cases of fair trade produce in different countries, and our main claim is broader, that in general, if you buy foods from fair trade producers, you're going to help ensure that they are justly compensated. So this is inductive reasoning. The next type of reasoning we have is called deductive, and this is the inverse of inductive. So instead of using a specific example to make a larger claim, we're using a larger, more generally held truth to make a more specific or focused in claim. So here we have 3 components. We have our major premise, which is a general case, and is supported by a specific example, a minor premise that leads to a conclusion. But here we have to be careful and be mindful of hasty generalizations, where an isolated case may not be true for all of the time. So here's an example of deductive reasoning. So our general case, regular aerobic exercise improves heart health. Generally speaking, we all agree with that. We know that's true. There's numerous studies that would support that statement. So here's our specific case, our specific evidence. Swimming is a form of aerobic exercise. Our conclusion, therefore, swimming regularly will improve your cardiovascular health. So here our conclusion is specifically about swimming and heart health. Our general case is much more broader. It's just about aerobic exercise in general. So think of this as almost like a triangle where the wide part of the triangle is at the top and it goes down to the narrow conclusion. The next type of reasoning that we have is causal, and this is where you're using cause and effect relationship as proof and evidence and grounds for your claim. But just as we had to be careful of hasty generalizations, we have to be careful of false cause fallacy. So here's the example of causal reasoning. So our cause is going to be climate change, and here we would want to provide all of the different reasons and evidence that we have for climate change, likely studies, testimonies by environmental scholars, and then the effect is stronger hurricanes. So our claim is stronger hurricanes are caused by climate change. So here we're showing a cause and effect relationship to show that not only does climate change cause hurricanes, but it causes stronger hurricanes than what would naturally occur. The next type of reasoning we have is analogical reasoning. And so this is using analogies to create the relationship between the evidence and the claim. So for this one, we're comparing two similar cases and saying that what is true in one case is going to be true in the other. So here's an example, and it's a little wordy, but I'll go through it and then I'll explain it afterwards. So here is our claim. Lifting economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for a temporary halt in its pursuit of nuclear weapons risks creating another North Korea. So here's our evidence. Under the Clinton administration, North Korea used the loosening of sanctions as an opportunity to double its program, just as the Iranians are doing now. So here is the warrant, the connection between the evidence and the claim, and this is where we see the analogy come out. Iran, like North Korea, is an anti-American theocratic regime that cannot be trusted to do as it says. Now, whether that is true, Iran really is anti-American, is perhaps besides the point. What I really want you to see and understand is that you're comparing two things. You're comparing Iran and North Korea, and you're saying that because it is similar in one sense, it's going to be similar in another sense. So because the US is treating its nuclear weapon program the same way, the countries are going to have similar responses of anti-American sentiments back to us. So this one's a little complicated, but you're saying because these two things are similar here, they're also going to be similar here, even though one of them hasn't happened yet. And the last example of reasoning that we have is reasoning by sign. And so this is really similar to causal, but it doesn't necessarily have a cause and effect relationship. Instead, it's assuming something exists or will happen based on something else that exists or has happened. So you want to ask yourself all of these questions to make sure that you are choosing the right type of sign. And if the answer is yes to all of these questions, is there an alternative explanation that's more credible? Is it an isolated instance? Are there times where a sign doesn't lead to a certain event? Then you want to rethink and maybe not use this type of reasoning. But if the answers are all no to those questions, then you might have a solid argument. So this one I think is helpful to understand with the example. So this particular one talks about the Richter scale, which is an instrument that measures seismic activity and lets us know how powerful an earthquake is. So the sign is every time the Richter scale registers above a certain level for specifically an undersea earthquake, a tsunami occurs. And the claim is when a Richter scale registers above that level, there will be a tsunami. So here the sign is the Richter scale. The Richter scale is an instrument that detects and measures seismic activity, but it does not cause the earthquake. So this is why it isn't causal, because it's not a cause and effect relationship. Instead, something is a sign of something else. So another example of a sign would be If your fire alarm goes off in your apartment or in your house or in your dorm room, there's a good chance that there is fire, if not just smoke, because the fire alarm is a sign, is a signal of something else, but the fire alarm doesn't cause the fire to happen, but instead it's a sign, it's an indicator that it's going on. So those are the different types of organizational patterns. As you are doing research and developing your speech and your argument, try to be mindful of what are the ways that the pieces of evidence you're finding support your claim, support your topic, your overall proposition. And so now what we're going to talk about is a bit more of a involved way of creating an argument that you can use any of the different types of reasoning patterns that we just went over. You can use that in what we call the Tolman model. And so the Tolman model of argumentation was named after a British philosopher named Stephen Tolman. And what it is, it's a way of providing organizational structure for constructing critical and persuasive arguments. And it is a really clear way of strengthening our arguments. So we want to be incorporating this Tolman model into our speech somehow, some way, or even just incorporating a couple parts of the Tolman model. So just as a reminder, these words we're going to be returning to. So the argument is the stated position, including evidence and reasoning. Your claim is your proposition. What are you trying to prove? This is going to be your topic and position. The evidence is the supporting materials providing grounds for belief, and the warrant is the connection between the evidence and the claim. So the reasons, justifications for why the evidence supports the claim. So with the Tolman model, there's 6 different components, and they've been broken up into triads. So the first triad talks about the claim, evidence, warrant. The second triad is the backing, rebuttal, and qualifier. So as we are developing our speeches, this first triad I think is so important and something that we need to have in every single piece of evidence that we have. We provide the evidence, we remind our audience of what our claim is, but we need to have the warrant connecting the two. So let's go through these first 3 elements, the first triad. So let's say our claim is my car is on fire. That would be a question of fact, right? We're trying to convince our audience that something is true, something is happening, something is a fact. My car is on fire. So the evidence that we have to support our claim is that there is smoke coming from my car. With this, in our minds, we can probably make the mental leap between the smoke coming from our car and our claim that our car is on fire. But what we want to do is clearly state the connection between the two. Why does this piece of evidence support my claim? How is it related? So the warrant is where there is smoke, there must be fire. Right? In our minds, we already do that. We know that smoke is a byproduct of fire, but we want to say that because it may not be as obvious to our audience, and our claim may not be as clear as trying to convince someone that our car is on fire. So we need to have our claim, our evidence, our warrant. We can arrange them in any order. So we could do it this way. The piece of evidence first, there is smoke coming from my car, the warrant next. We know that where there is smoke, there must be fire, claim, therefore, my car is on fire, right? And so this would be deductive reasoning because we are going from a broadly kind of held truth where there is smoke, there must be fire, to a more specific claim that my car is on fire. So now let's talk about the second triad, the last 3 components of the Tolman model. So first we have backing, and backing is really similar to evidence, but instead of supporting the claim, it supports the warrant. It is not a necessary component, but it can be helpful if your warrant isn't as obvious to your audience. And we'll go through all of these in a second. Next, we have the rebuttal. So first you need to have the counter argument, which raises potential objections to the claim, and your rebuttal is mitigating those objections by suggesting the reasons the counter argument is flawed. We talked about the counter argument last week. That is the other side of the debate, or maybe just another opinion, another perspective. So in the Tolman model, you need to know what the counter argument is and have a counter for the counter argument, which is what we call the rebuttal. And then lastly, you're going to include a qualifier. And a qualifier is an edit, an adjustment to your claim that makes your claim more true in more situations. So let's go through an example of all of the different components. So over here, we have grounds, and this is another word for evidence. Oftentimes, we'll use these interchangeably. And then we have our claim. So let's start with our claim. A 15% service charge should be added to patrons' checks in lieu of tipping. So this particular argument is talking about restaurants and whether you should take away patrons' options to tip, because oftentimes when you go into a restaurant, you know that you're expected to tip 15 to 20% of the bill, but this claim is saying that it should be automatically charged and it will be a flat 15%. So that's what the claim is. The evidence that we're using to support that claim is right here. Waitresses who make a dependable wage will be less likely to leave present employment. So now we need to connect this piece of evidence to the claim. So what is it about dependable wages and wanting to stay at their job that will make this mandatory service charge a good option? And for that, we go to the warrant. Because a high turnover of employees reflects unfavorably on profits. Essentially, they're saying, we want our waitresses, we want our waiters, our servers to stick around, to not leave the jobs because it is expensive to hire new individuals. And that is where we can see the backing. So the backing explains why it's expensive to hire and train new employees, since paperwork and training and hiring new employees are time consuming and costly. So that is the backing. The backing is evidence that supports the warrant. So if we have all of this, our grounds, our warrant, our backing, and our claim, that could be a strong argument. But we know that we have to include the counter argument at least once and at least somewhere in our speech. So we could do it when we are doing this Tolman model. So the rebuttal would be, well, what if the waiters and waitresses and all of the servers, they don't give as good a service to their customers because they know no matter how nice or how awful they are, they're going to get the same tip. That's the rebuttal. So the rebuttal is, unless the waitress's reactions to the new policy result in poor service, a claim should be happening. So with the rebuttal, you're acknowledging that this is an option, but you're saying, until it's an actuality, until it's a reality, I still believe that this claim is going to be stronger. So the qualifier here is, so maybe unless waitresses' reactions to the new policy result in poor service, a 15% service charge should be added to patrons' checks in lieu of tipping. So all of this combined, all 6 different elements, is the Tolman model. This is a really great place to start as you are developing your speech, to write this all out. And your claim, you could put your topic and your position on the topic over here, and then using a specific piece of evidence, and do all of this work to connect the evidence to your claim. And that can be a really great way of starting to develop your main points, develop your argument. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate that, and continue on with the rest of the module. Thank you.